Carla Walker was kidnapped in Fort Worth when she was 17. Her family told Kevin Reese they hope this new clue can finally bring closure.
Nearly 50 years after a Fort Worth teenager's murder, a suspect is behind bars. And it's a man who had been on the radar the whole time.
Police in Fort Worth have arrested a man accused of abducting and killing then 17-year-old Carla Walker. According to detectives, DNA evidence has linked a suspect previously on their radar.
50 years ago, a 17-year-old girl in Fort Worth, Texas, walked out a Valentine's Day dance with her boyfriend, kissed him goodnight in the parking lot, and never made it home. Carla Walker disappeared in the span of a few seconds, taken from a crowded parking lot while her family slept and her community celebrated one of the most romantic nights of the year. Law enforcement searched, questioned, and investigated for years, but no suspect was ever charged, and the case grew colder with every decade that passed. However, through all those years, one piece of biological evidence collected from Carla's body was never discarded, preserved through generations of detectives who refused to close the file. Then, in 2020, a genealogist working from a laptop and a database built by ordinary people tracing their family trees pointed directly to a name that had been living in Tarrant County for half a century. And what investigators found when they looked at that name stunned an entire community in a way no one could have imagined after 50 years of waiting. Before we dive deeper into the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you like videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In 1974, America was living through one of the most turbulent years of the entire decade. The Watergate scandal had consumed Washington for months, and on August 9th of that year, Richard Nixon became the first American president in history to resign from office. Gerald Ford stepped into the Oval Office and told a nation exhausted by lies, "Our long national nightmare is over." Americans wanted to believe him. They wanted to feel safe again. In Fort Worth, Texas, a city of 400,000 people spread across the flat prairies of Tarrant County in the heart of North Texas. Life moved at the pace of a place that believed in itself. Neighbors left their doors unlocked. Children walked home from school alone. And on Valentine's Day weekend, families sent their teenagers to dances at the local bowling alley without a second thought, because in Fort Worth in 1974, there was no reason to think twice. Carla Walker was 17 years old, a junior at Castleberry High School in Fort Worth. Blonde hair, easy smile, the kind of girl who made the people around her feel comfortable just by being in the room. She was a daughter, a sister, a girlfriend. Someone her family described as full of life in the specific way that means she actually was, not just in the way people reach for words when they have nothing left to say. On the evening of February 17, 1974, Carla went to a Valentine's Day dance at the Rainbow Bowling Lanes on Jacksboro Highway. She went with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. She wore a red dress. She danced. She laughed. She was 17 years old on Valentine's Day with her boyfriend in a bowling alley, and everything about that night was exactly what was supposed to be, until it wasn't. At approximately midnight on February 17, 1974, the dance at Rainbow Bowling Lanes was winding down. Carla and Rodney walked out to the parking lot together. They said goodnight. Rodney watched Carla walk toward her family's car. He got into his own vehicle. He drove away. That was the last time anyone who loved Carla Walker saw her alive. At some point between midnight and the early hours of February 18th, while other teenagers were still filtering out of the bowling alley and into the cold Texas night, someone approached Carla Walker in that parking lot, a public space, lit in the middle of a crowd, and took her. No one saw it happen. No one heard anything. No one called the police because no one knew there was anything to call about. By the time her family realized she had not come home, the parking lot was empty and the night had swallowed every trace of what happened. 3 days later, on February 20th, 1974, Carla Walker's body was found in a culvert in the 5700 block of Pagosa Street in Fort Worth, less than 10 miles from the bowling alley. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her red dress was still on her body. Detective W.D. Birch of the Fort Worth Police Department was among the first investigators at the scene. He worked methodically. He documented everything he found. He collected biological material from Carla's body and her clothing, and he preserved it, a DNA sample that in 1974 was nothing more than physical evidence with no name attached to it, no technology capable of reading it, no database to compare it against. Birch could not have known what that sample would become. He simply kept it because a detective keeps evidence. And that decision, made on a cold February morning in 1974 by a man doing his job, would turn out to be the only thing standing between a killer and permanent total freedom 5 decades later. Fort Worth police launched an immediate investigation. Detectives canvassed the Rainbow Bowling Lane's parking lot, interviewed every teenager who had attended the Valentine's Day dance, and questioned Rodney McCoy at length. Rodney was cleared. He had been seen leaving before Carla disappeared, and there was nothing in the evidence pointing toward him. The investigation spread outward from the parking lot to Carla's school, her neighborhood, her family circle of acquaintances, and eventually to individuals with prior criminal records in Tarrant County who fit no particular profile. Hundreds of interviews, dozens of follow-up visits, every lead documented, every tip pursued until it stopped going anywhere. Witnesses at the bowling alley that night provided no reliable description of anyone approaching Carla in the parking lot. No one had seen a struggle. No one had seen a vehicle leaving in a hurry. The parking lot on Jacksboro Highway on Valentine's Day weekend, full of teenagers and noise and distraction, had somehow provided no usable witness account of the moment Carla vanished. In the years that followed, as DNA technology began entering American criminal investigations, Fort Worth police submitted the biological evidence from Carla's case to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, the National Criminal DNA Database, containing profiles of people who have been arrested and convicted across the United States. No match came back. The reason was simple and infuriating. The man who killed Carla Walker had no criminal record. He had never been arrested. He had never been convicted of anything. His DNA was not in any system because the system had never had reason to collect it. The database could only find what it contained, and what it contained did not include him. The case went cold, not because investigators stopped caring, not because the evidence disappeared, but because the technology of the era had reached its absolute limit, and the killer had given the system nothing to grab onto. While Carla's family buried their daughter and Fort Worth police kept the file open on a desk somewhere in Tarrant County, the man who had been in that parking lot on Valentine's Day 1974 returned to his life. He lived in the Fort Worth area. He was known in his neighborhood. He had a family. He was the kind of man neighbors nodded to when they passed on the street. The kind of man no one thought twice about. The kind of man who had lived in Tarrant County for decades without a single arrest, a single complaint, a single reason for law enforcement to look in his direction. No criminal record. No police file. No reason for his name to appear in any database anywhere in the country. 47 years. Long enough for Carla Walker's younger relatives to grow up never having met her. 47 years. And the man who killed her was still in the same county, still aging, still living the ordinary life of someone who believed, and had every reason to believe, that he had gotten away with it completely. No name had ever surfaced in the investigation. No tip had ever pointed in his direction. No witness had ever placed him in that parking lot on Jacksboro Highway. He had been present at a Valentine's Day dance in 1974, and then he had simply continued existing, invisible to every detective who had ever worked Carla Walker's case. The 1980s arrived, then the 1990s. Fort Worth grew and expanded outward across the Tarrant County prairie, built new highways and new neighborhoods and new lives. Children who were born after February 1974 grew up, had children of their own, and knew nothing about the girl in the red dress who never made a home from the bowling alley on Jacksboro Highway. But for Carla's family, for her father Lloyd Walker, who spent years asking questions that no one could answer, time did not move that way. It accumulated. Every February, the weight of the 17th came back. Every year without an answer was another year added to a debt that no one was paying. Every anniversary article in the local paper, every cold case list that carried her name, every well-meaning person who said they hoped it would be solved one day, all of it was a reminder that the answer was still out there somewhere, attached to a name no one had yet spoken. The case file remained open at the Fort Worth Police Department. Detectives across multiple generations received it, reviewed it, and set it down with the same frustration their predecessors had felt. The biological evidence sat in the property room, preserved, intact, waiting. The only thread connecting the present to a February midnight in 1974. But a thread requires something to pull on, and for decades, there was nothing to pull. In April 2018, the entire country watched the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, a man who had murdered at least 13 people and sexually assaulted more than 50 victims across California during the 1970s and 1980s, and who had lived free for more than 40 years. He was caught not through traditional investigation, not through a witness who finally came forward, not through confession. He was caught through genetic genealogy, a technique that changed the entire landscape of cold case investigation the moment his name was read in a Sacramento courtroom. The idea behind it was straightforward, but it had never been done before at this scale. Instead of searching for a suspect's DNA directly in criminal databases, which only contained DNA from people with criminal records, investigators ran the crime scene DNA through public genealogy databases, platforms like GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA, where millions of ordinary Americans had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA to trace their ancestry and find distant relatives. From those partial matches, genealogists built family trees, working backward through generations to find common ancestors, then forward again through branches and descendants, narrowing from thousands of possible relatives down to a handful of individuals who fit the age, the gender, and the geography of the crime. Fort Worth police and Tarrant County investigators had followed the Golden State Killer case with a specific attention of people who had something at stake. They reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, the private forensic DNA analysis company that had played a central role in the DeAngelo identification, and submitted the biological evidence from Carla Walker's case. The DNA sample that W.D. Birch had preserved on a cold February morning in 1974 was finally going to be read in a language that 1974 had no words for. Genealogist Jennifer Locke was assigned to the case. She ran the DNA profile against GeneMatch and began the meticulous, painstaking work of building family trees from the partial matches that came back, relatives of the killer, people who shared common ancestors with him, people who had uploaded their DNA to find out where their grandparents came from, with no idea that their results were now pointing a cold case investigator toward a murder committed before some of them were born. The trees branched outward, then narrowed. Thousands of possible individuals became hundreds. Hundreds became dozens. Dozens became a small number of men in Tarrant County, Texas. The right age, the right background, the right family lines intersected with the DNA matches in exactly the pattern that could not be explained by coincidence. One name remained when all the others had been eliminated: Glenn Samuel McCurley, 77 years old, a retired pipe inspector who had lived in the Fort Worth area for decades, a man with no criminal record, no prior arrests, no history in any law enforcement database in the country, a man whose neighbors knew his face and whose community knew his name, someone people had lived alongside for years without a single reason to think anything was wrong, a man who had been present at Rainbow Bowling Lanes on the night of February 17, 1974. The same night Carla Walker walked out of that building in her red dress and never made it home. Investigators did not approach McCurley immediately. A direct approach would have been a mistake. It would expose the investigation, give him time to prepare, and destroy the only element they still had working in their favor. Instead, they placed him under surveillance. They tracked his movements and his routine. They waited for the moment he left behind DNA on a discarded item, the kind of voluntary sample a court would accept without question. In 2020, McCurley discarded an item during his daily routine. Investigators retrieved it without his knowledge and sent it directly to the lab. The DNA from that discarded item was compared against the biological evidence W.D. Birch had collected from Carla Walker's body 46 years earlier. The result was a complete match. 47 years of silence, 47 years of an open file, and a preserved sample, and a family that never stopped asking. And then one result from one lab comparison, and the silence broke. On September 10th, 2020, Glenn Samuel McCurley was arrested at his home in Fort Worth, Texas, 46 years, 6 months, and 21 days after Carla Walker walked out of Rainbow Bowling Lanes and did not come home. He was charged with capital murder. Tarrant County District Attorney Sharon Wilson stood before the press and spoke clearly. We never gave up on Carla Walker. Thanks to advances in DNA technology and the dedication of investigators across multiple generations, we are finally able to bring this case before a jury. The Fort Worth community's reaction was not simple surprise that a cold case had been solved after nearly 5 decades. It was something heavier and harder to digest. The slow, settling realization that McCurley had been living among them for all of those years. A man their parents' generation might have known by name. A man who had watched Fort Worth grow and change and build itself up around him while Carla's family grew older and her case file gathered dust in a property room. He had been right there, the whole time, unremarkable, unnoticed, free. Lloyd Walker, Carla's father, heard the news of the arrest at 88 years old. He had spent nearly half a century asking one question. He now had a name to attach to the answer. The trial of Glenn Samuel McCurley opened in October 2021 at the Tarrant County Criminal District Court. McCurley was 77 years old. He pleaded not guilty. The prosecution built its case on the DNA evidence. The biological material preserved from Carla's body in 1974 and the sample collected from McCurley in 2020 matched with a statistical probability that left no scientific room for an alternative explanation. Forensic experts walked the jury through the genetic genealogy process with precision, explaining step by step how a partial match in a public database had produced a family tree that produced a name, and how that name had been confirmed by a discard item and a lab comparison that took 46 years of waiting and collapsed into a single unambiguous result. The defense challenged the genealogy methodology, arguing it was too new and too untested to serve as a foundation for a capital murder conviction. The jury heard both arguments across multiple days of testimony. Then Carla's family spoke. Her sister, Debbie Malone, stood before the court and looked directly at Glenn McCurley. You took everything from us. You took Carla on Valentine's Day, the day that is supposed to be about love, and you left our family with nothing but questions for 47 years. You got to live your life. You got to grow old. Carla never got to do any of that. She was 17 years old, and she was wearing a red dress, and she should have come home. The jury deliberated and returned their verdict, guilty of capital murder. Judge Rob Catalano addressed McCurley directly before sentencing, describing the nature of what he had done and the decades during which he had lived without accountability for it. He sentenced Glenn Samuel McCurley to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 77 years old, that sentence meant exactly what it said. He would die in a Texas state prison. Tarrant County DA Sharon Wilson stood before the press after sentencing and said, "Justice was a long time coming for Carla Walker and her family. But it came. 47 years later, it came." The Carla Walker case does not carry the kind of systemic failure found in cases where a known offender slipped through repeated official checks. McCurley had no prior record. There was no parole officer who should have been monitoring him. There was no database that should have flagged his name and didn't. The failure here is a different kind, and in some ways a more uncomfortable one, because it cannot be blamed on a single decision or a single institution. The failure was structural. The technology to find Glenn McCurley simply did not exist in 1974, and for the 46 years between that February morning and the day Jennifer Locke ran his family's DNA through GMatch, the system had no mechanism to reach beyond the boundaries of its own databases to find a killer who had never given law enforcement a reason to notice him. What the Carla Walker case exposed is the blind spot that existed at the center of American cold case investigation for decades. Any killer with no prior criminal record was effectively invisible to Cody's, permanently, regardless of how much biological evidence had been preserved. Genetic genealogy filled that gap, and the question the case forces every jurisdiction to answer is direct. How many property rooms across America contain preserved biological evidence from unsolved homicides that has never been submitted for genetic genealogy analysis? According to cold case investigators who have spoken publicly since McCurley's conviction, the answer is thousands. The technology exists. The question is whether the institutional will exist to use it. The Carla Walker case leaves 3 lessons that anyone concerned with cold case justice and personal safety needs to carry forward. The first lesson is about preserved evidence and the people who preserve it. W.D. Birch collected biological evidence from Carla Walker's body in February 1974 with no understanding of what DNA technology would eventually become. He preserved it because that is what a detective does. You collect everything, you document everything, you keep everything, because you cannot know in 1974 what 2020 will be capable of reading. That professional instinct, exercised on a cold morning in Fort Worth by a man doing his job, is the sole reason Glenn McCurley was ever identified. If that evidence had been discarded during a property room purge, during a budget cut, during any one of the hundreds of administrative decisions that happen across 47 years in a law enforcement agency, the case ends permanently. Every jurisdiction in America needs a formal, enforceable policy requiring biological evidence from unsolved homicides to be preserved indefinitely, not until the case goes cold, not for 25 years. Indefinitely. If you live in a community that does not have that policy in writing, that is a policy worth advocating for. The second lesson is for the families of cold case victims. If your loved one's case was investigated before the year 2000 and has never been solved, contact the investigating agency today and ask two specific questions. Has the biological evidence been retested using current DNA technology? And has a DNA profile been submitted to Parabon Nanolabs or a comparable genetic genealogy service for family tree analysis? These are not aggressive questions. They are reasonable, specific, and informed requests. The technology that identified Glenn McCurley is not theoretical. It is operational. It has solved cases across the United States in the years since the Golden State Killer arrest, and it has solved cases far colder than Carla Walker's. You have the right to ask whether it has been applied to your family's case. And if the answer is no, you have every right to ask why. The third lesson is the one this case delivers quietly, but without any softening. Glenn McCurley abducted Carla Walker from a lit, crowded parking lot on a holiday weekend, surrounded by other people, and no one saw it happen. The most dangerous assumption any of us carry on any given night is that a public space with other people present is automatically safe. It is safer than an isolated space. It is not safe. The 30 seconds between leaving a lit building and locking yourself inside your vehicle are exactly the seconds when attention drops, when awareness narrows, when the transition itself creates a gap. When you are in a parking lot at night, particularly when you are moving from a social space to your car, when your attention is on your keys or your phone or the conversation you just left, be aware of who is nearby. Move with purpose. Get in. Lock the door. Those seconds matter for Carla Walker on Jacksboro Highway on February 17, 1974. They matter every time any of us makes that same walk across a parking lot at night. If you watched this far, leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. If you found this video valuable, please hit subscribe and share it so stories like this can continue to be told. Because every share from you might be what reminds someone out there to stay aware in a parking lot, or gives a grieving family the courage to make one phone call that changes everything. Thank you for watching until the end, and see you in the next.